Not every mystery begins with a grand crime. Some start with something so ordinary, it's almost easy to ignore. On a quiet afternoon in the heart of London, a single sandal was discovered lodged high up in the branches of an old oak tree. No footprints led to it. No ladder marks were found. It was as if the sandal had simply appeared there. Neighbors were puzzled. Passersby stared. But when Sherlock Holmes arrived, he saw more than just misplaced footwear. He saw the beginning of a puzzle. Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, Holmes follows a trail that begins with a single sandal in a tree and ends somewhere no one expected. Stay with me till the end, because the truth behind this odd discovery isn't just clever, it's brilliantly unexpected. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a mystery, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see detectives from around the world join the hunt. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second until the very end. Chapter 1: The Impossible Crime. It was upon a bleak March morning that the singular case which I have here set forth first came to our attention. A heavy mist clung to the streets of London, rendering the gas lamps mere wavering halos in a sea of gloom. Holmes, ever impervious to the chill, lounged upon the settee at Baker Street, his long, sinewy frame folded like a mantis at rest. His sharp eyes, however, were anything but dormant. They darted from the columns of the Times to the curling smoke of his pipe, as though the smallest tremor in the air could reveal some hidden truth. I had been regaling him with the latest developments in my medical practice, news which he received with his usual courtesy and thin-lipped smile when Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man whose appearance suggested the deepest agitation. His garments, though of good quality, were disheveled as if donned in haste, and his features were pale, almost waxen, beneath the exertion of some profound distress. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice breaking on the second syllable. The same Holmes returned in that cool, even tone which seemed to restore composure by the mere force of its calm. "Pray be seated, sir. You are come to us, I perceive, directly from the vicinity of Regent's Park, having traversed a damp and rather muddy path, and your affair concerns an object which has lately been suspended above the ordinary level of human sight." The man blinked at Holmes as though he had been struck. His lips parted soundlessly for a moment before he sank into the chair which Holmes indicated. "Good heavens," he whispered. "Then you know why I am here?" Holmes waved a languid hand. "I know nothing beyond the obvious. The rest, sir, must be your province." The fellow swallowed hard, then drew forth a crumpled letter from his inner pocket. His hands trembled so violently that I, in pity, relieved him of the task and laid the paper upon Holmes' knee. It bore the letterhead of Lord Lionel Weatherby, a name well known in social circles. Holmes' eyebrows rose a fraction as he read the brief lines. Then he looked up, his expression of polite interest mingled with the faintest glimmer of amusement. "And so, Dr. Watson," said he, "we are confronted with a sandal in a tree." "A sandal," I repeated, incredulous. "Precisely a lady's sandal, of fine leather and dainty construction, discovered this very morning, suspended among the upper branches of an elm upon Lord Wetherby's country estate. An object of trifling consequence, one might suppose. And yet, here Holmes tapped the letter with a forefinger. Its position is such as to render natural accident a virtual impossibility. Lord Wetherby, finding his voice, broke in with a kind of desperate eagerness. It is not the mere fact of the sandal, Mr. Holmes, but what accompanies it. The tree stands some 20 feet from the terrace of the east wing, beneath the windows of my daughter's apartments. At dawn, my gardener, one Martin Holt, espied the sandal caught among the branches no great height, perhaps 12 feet from the ground. But, sir, the ground beneath was untrodden, soft with the previous night's rain, and utterly without trace of ladder, footprint, or climbing implement of any sort. More alarming still, the window to my daughter's room was found unlatched from within, though she swears she left it fastened when she retired. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his long fingers steepled. And the young lady herself, she is unharmed. She is unharmed, yes, yes, though sorely unnerved. Eleanor is of a delicate constitution, Mr. Holmes, and this affair has shaken her profoundly. She professes entire ignorance of how her sandal could have found its way into that tree. The article is one she wore yesterday evening, yet she declares it was in its place when she prepared for bed. Holmes regarded him with that inscrutable gaze which had cowed so many a hardened criminal. "A curious point," he murmured. "Pray, continue." "There is little more to tell," Wetherby replied, passing a trembling hand across his brow. "I summoned the local constable, who examined the spot with zeal, but without result. No marks, no sign of intrusion. The house was locked, the servants in their quarters, and my daughter slept soundly, so she avers from midnight until my summons this morning. And yet," here his voice sank to a hoarse whisper, "and yet, 2 nights past, a groom swore he heard footsteps near the south lawn, at an hour when none should have been abroad. I dismissed it as fancy. God help me, perhaps I was wrong." Holmes rose abruptly, his tall figure looming against the firelight. "Lord Wetherby," said he, "you have been wise to seek counsel. The matter presents features of peculiar interests, so much so, indeed, that I am half inclined to thank you for your visit. Watson, I think we shall exchange our London fog for a breath of Surrey air." I confess I could not share Holmes' enthusiasm. A sandal in a tree seemed but a trifle scarce worth his genius. Yet I had learned by bitter experience that no case is trivial in his eyes which bears the faintest odor of the inexplicable. "Tell me," Holmes resumed, "this tree upon which our sandal reposes, what is its aspect?" "A noble elm, sir, rising from the edge of a copse which skirts the east lawn. Its branches are sturdy, but the trunk shows no recent mark of climbing. The gardener swears it." Holmes' eyes glittered. "So much the better. I trust you have left the scene undisturbed." "To the last twig, Mr. Holmes. The sandal remains where it was found." "Admirable," Holmes exclaimed, with a sudden ring of animation. "Then, Lord Wetherby, you may expect us upon the afternoon train. Meanwhile, Watson, the game is afoot." Chapter 2. The summons to Surrey had accompanied Holmes on many strange adventures, but seldom had I seen him so animated upon the prospect of an inquiry which, to my unimaginative mind, seemed of the most trifling consequence. Yet, as the cab bore us through the swirling fog toward Charing Cross, my companion's keen profile etched in silhouette against the window bespoke an inward excitement which I could neither fathom nor share. The hawk-like nose, the firm-set lips, the occasional flash of gray eyes beneath those dark brows all betrayed the concentration of a mind already grappling with some elusive chain of reasoning. You appear to treat this affair with a gravity scarcely justified by the facts, I ventured, breaking a silence that had endured for several minutes. After all, Holmes, what is it but a lady's shoe caught among the branches of a tree? Surely such things have happened by pure chance. Holmes smiled faintly, without removing his gaze from the gloom beyond. Your remark, Watson, is as sound in form as it is hollow in substance. Chance, my dear fellow, is an easy cloak for ignorance. When you can demonstrate by evidence that the sandal in question arrived at its arboreal resting place through natural agency, I shall be the first to concede your point. Until then, I prefer to regard it as the central feature of a problem which promises to tax all our resources. But surely, I persisted, there is nothing criminal in the matter. Lord Weatherby's household is above reproach, and his daughter's alarm may spring from mere girlish fancy. Girlish fancy does not unlatch windows in the dead of night, said Holmes dryly, nor does it transport articles of apparel to positions incompatible with human locomotion. No, Watson, beneath this veneer of triviality lurks a set of conditions most irregular, and, if I mistake not, most sinister. I could not but smile at the earnestness with which he uttered this pronouncement. And yet, I said, you cannot deny that the absence of footprints or other signs argues against the presence of an intruder. On the contrary, it argues powerfully for it, Holmes retorted with sudden emphasis. An effect without a cause, Watson, is an absurdity. The sandal did not sprout from the tree by spontaneous generation. Someone placed it there. That we find no trace of the agent merely transforms a simple inquiry into an intellectual chess match, precisely the sort of engagement in which you know I delight. Seeing that further protest was useless, I contented myself with the reflection that at least the journey promised a respite from the leaden skies and crowded pavements of London. As we rattled into the station yard, I observed Holmes glancing at his watch with an air of suppressed impatience. The 1:15 for Guildford, he murmured. Excellent. We shall be at Weatherby Hall before the daylight fails. Come, Watson, there is no time for loitering. The train had scarcely cleared the suburban stations before Holmes drew from his pocket a small leather notebook, the pages of which were already scored with hieroglyphic jottings. Pray favor me with your attention for a moment, he said. You will remember that Lord Weatherby stated the sandal belonged to his daughter, and that she last wore it upon the preceding evening. It was then restored, as she avers, to its accustomed place. Yet this morning it appears in a position both elevated and remote, while the ground beneath remains untrodden. Add to this the unlatched window, the gardener's early discovery, and the groom's report of footsteps 2 nights past. What inferences do you draw? I pondered the question, conscious of his searching gaze. The window suggests the possibility of entry, I said at length. The absence of marks might indicate that the intruder gained access by some means other than the garden, perhaps from within the house itself. A just observation, though still rudimentary, Holmes commented, jotting a line in his notebook. Consider, too, the psychological element. What conceivable motive impels a human being to abstract a lady's sandal, convey it unseen to a tree, and deposit it among the branches? Theft, absurd. The article is of no value. Mischief, perhaps, but why the elaborate precautions? No, Watson, we are in the presence of design, not caprice. You think, then, the act was deliberate? Deliberate, premeditated, and mark me fraught with significance. The very grotesqueness of the method proclaims it. Criminal lunacy, you will say. Possibly, but even lunacy works along lines of its own perverted logic. Our task is to trace that logic to its ultimate term. His words, uttered with quiet intensity, stirred in me a sense of foreboding which I could neither define nor dispel. The rhythmic throb of the engine, the blurred hedgerows streaming past the windows, seemed to beat time to some sinister undercurrent in his thought. More than once I was surprised a peculiar light in his eyes, the light of a hunter who scents his quarry afar. It was late afternoon when we descended at a little wayside station, where a dog-cart awaited us in charge of a groom. Lord Weatherby, he informed us, had returned directly to the hall to make preparations for our comfort. The drive lay through rolling country, bare now of leaves and touched with the somber tints of early spring. Presently a sweep of gravel brought us before the stately facade of Weatherby Hall, a noble pile of mellow stone, its windows glimmering faintly in the waning light. As we mounted the steps, the great door swung open, and Lord Weatherby himself advanced with both hands outstretched. "My dear Mr. Holmes, this is kindness indeed," he cried. "And Dr. Watson, I presume. Welcome, gentlemen, 1,000 times welcome. Pray enter, your rooms are prepared, and supper shall be served at your pleasure." Holmes acknowledged the greeting with a brief inclination. His glance, quick as a rapier thrust, swept the hall with its carved oak panels and tapestried walls, lingered an instant on a distant staircase, and came back to rest upon our host with a look of quiet significance. "If you will permit me," said he, "I should prefer to see the east wing before we refresh ourselves. The light, though failing, may yet suffice." "By all means this way," exclaimed Weatherby, with a nervous eagerness he strove in vain to disguise. As we followed him across the echoing floor, I caught a murmured phrase from Holmes' lips, a phrase that sent a chill along my spine. "The stage is set, Watson," said he softly. "Now for the players." Chapter 3: Shadows in the East Wing. The east wing of Weatherby Hall lay in a hushed and somewhat melancholy seclusion. Its long corridor, dimly lit by narrow windows of stained glass, stretched away into a vista of dark panels and carved lintels, where the hush of centuries seemed to brood. Our footfalls awakened ghostly echoes as Lord Weatherby conducted us to a door at the farther end, a heavy, iron-studded door which swung open upon a spacious bedchamber. "Mr. Holmes," said our host, pausing upon the threshold, "is my daughter's room the scene of that most unaccountable occurrence?" The chamber was furnished with that stately simplicity which belongs to old English houses. A canopied bed stood against one wall, a tall mirror gleamed between the windows, and a great fireplace yawned black and cavernous in the failing light. At first glance there was nothing to distinguish the apartment from a score of others which I had seen. Yet, as my eye traveled from object to object, a certain impression of order, disturbed by stealth, grew upon me. though I could scarcely define its source. Holmes advanced without a word. His keen glance swept the room with a rapidity which bespoke a long habit, then lingered upon the windows, 2 in number, facing eastward toward the park. One of these stood slightly ajar, its curtains swaying faintly in the evening air. "You found it thus?" he inquired. "Precisely as you see," Lord Weatherby replied. "It opens upon a narrow balcony, as you perceive, some 12 feet above the ground. The gardener assures me there were no marks upon the soil below." Holmes bent forward, scrutinizing the casement with an absorbed intentness. Presently he produced a lens from his pocket and, kneeling, examined the inner ledge minutely. The monosyllable escaped him like the click of a trigger. He continued his inspection along the sill, then rose and turned to the carpet, over which he moved with slow, gliding steps, pausing now and then to stoop and peer as though the pattern held some occult significance. Meanwhile, I approached the balcony. The evening had deepened to a somber twilight, and the park stretched away in long undulations of turf and coppice, where the last gleam of day lingered upon the upper boughs. A chill breeze stirred the branches of a giant oak that rose close to the wing, its gnarled limbs thrusting upward like the arms of some primeval monster. It needed but a glance to detect the sandal there it hung, entangled among the lesser branches a good 10 feet from the ground, its white strap fluttering like a signal of distress against the dark foliage. "An extraordinary position," I muttered. "How on earth, my dear Watson," said Holmes' voice at my elbow, "is precisely the point. How, indeed, save by an agency which left no record upon the soil. Observe the ground beneath, hard as flint, yet here and there a scatter of leaves which even the lightest tread must have disturbed. You perceive they lie undisturbed." I admitted the force of his reasoning, though it left me more perplexed than before. "May I ask, Holmes," said Lord Weatherby anxiously, "whether these observations suggest any theory?" "They suggest, at least, that your gardener's honesty is unimpeachable," returned Holmes dryly. "Beyond that, I have no opinion yet. Come, let us re-enter. The dusk thickens." Back in the chamber, Holmes resumed his scrutiny with an absorption which rendered him oblivious to our presence. Now he was peering up the chimney with a lighted taper, now crawling upon hands and knees beneath the bedstead, anon tapping the panels with the long, nervous fingers that seemed endowed with a sense of touch almost preternatural. Suddenly he paused before a tall the drawers of which stood slightly open. "Miss Weatherby's?" he asked. "Yes, she keeps her letters there," replied her father. Holmes' long hand hovered over the scattered sheets, but he forbore to touch them. His eye, however, had kindled with a gleam which told me he had noted something of import. He turned abruptly. "I must see Miss Weatherby," he said. "It is essential that I learn from her own lips the exact sequence of events." "Where is she now?" "In the south drawing-room with Lady Weatherby." "Then pray to inform her that I request the honor of a few moments' conversation." Lord Weatherby withdrew with alacrity, leaving us alone. Holmes stood motionless, his thin figure outlined against the curtained window, his gaze fixed upon vacancy as though following some invisible thread of thought. Once he drew from his pocket the little notebook, and I observed him inscribe a line with swift precision. Then, closing it with a snap, he turned to me. "Well, Watson," said he with a smile, in which I detected a shade of triumph. "We are gathering the threads, though the pattern is still obscure. Did you note the marks upon the inner ledge? I observed nothing beyond a faint discoloration." "Precisely. A faint smear of resinous substance-spine resin, if my nose serves me. Add to that a scrap of fibrous material adhering to the curtain hemp, beyond question. Now, what does that suggest?" I shook my head in despair. "I cannot even conjecture." "Nor need you yet," said Holmes suavely. "It is enough that I can. Ah, here comes our young lady." The door opened, and there entered a girl of singular graystall, fair, with that air of delicate breeding which no art can counterfeit. Her face, though pale, bore no sign of agitation beyond the natural embarrassment of one who finds herself the object of scrutiny. "You wished to speak with me, Mr. Holmes?" she said in a voice singularly sweet and low. "Briefly." "Miss Weatherby," replied my companion, bowing with old-fashioned courtesy, "pray be seated. I desire merely to ascertain the exact circumstances of last night in your own words." She complied without hesitation, her manner frank and composed. Yet, as she narrated how she had retired at her usual hour, how sleep had come and gone in troubled snatches, how at dawn she had discovered the open window and summoned her maid, I could not rid myself of a certain impression that beneath this calm recital there lurked a reserve, a shadow of unspoken fear. Holmes listened without comment, his eyes half closed, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. When she had finished, he thanked her with grave courtesy, and, as she withdrew, turned to me with that sudden, electric glance which I knew of old. "Watson," said he in a tone vibrant with suppressed energy, "the game is afoot indeed. Tomorrow we shall probe the roots of this mystery, and if I are not, pluck forth a secret that has struck deep." Chapter 4: The Gathering of Suspects. Following morning dawned with a wan and melancholy brightness that seemed strangely in harmony with the somber undercurrent pervading Weatherby Hall. A fine mist hung upon the park, veiling the distant trees in filmy gray and imparting to the ancient turrets an air of spectral remoteness. Holmes, who had risen betimes, spent the early hour pacing the gravelled terrace with head sunk upon his breast and hands thrust deep into the pockets of his dressing gown. That swift, light step, the occasional abrupt halt, the sudden upward flash of the keen gray eyesall were tokens to me that his brain was laboring upon some intricate problem whose solution still eluded him. "Watson," said he abruptly, when I joined him, "we shall have our hands full this day. I purposely bring the actors of this curious drama onto one stage and watch their interplay. A human face, my dear fellow, is oft more eloquent than a page of testimony. Come, our host awaits us." Lord Weatherby received us in the library, where a cheerful fire struggled gallantly against the damp chill that clung to the house. His lordship's ruddy countenance, however, bore marks of a sleepless night, and as Holmes imparted his intention of questioning certain members of the household, a gleam of relief lighted his anxious eyes. "By all means, Mr. Holmes," said he with emphasis. "The sooner this ghastly business is cleared, the better for us all. Whom do you wish to see first?" "The gardener, Thomas Grimshaw. After him, the groom sleeps in the stable loft. Then the maid Susan, I think you said. Finally, if convenient, your guest, Mr. Cyril Morton." The last name brought a swift contraction of his lordship's brows. But he merely bowed and rang the bell. The gardener entered, a grizzled, weather-beaten man, with the slow speech and wary eye of one accustomed to keeping his thoughts to himself. Holmes regarded him with that bland and careless air which I knew to be assumed for a purpose. "You are in charge of the grounds, Grimshaw. A responsible post. Pray inform me whether you heard or saw something unusual during the night preceding this singular occurrence." The man shifted from foot to foot, twisting his cap between horny fingers. "Nay, sir, not to speak on. I keep mostly to my cot o' nights. Might ha heard a branch crack once trees were whipping a bit in the wind. Ye see, but that's not out o' common." Holmes' lids drooped lazily. "Quite so. And you are familiar, no doubt, with the great oak beneath the east wing, oldest tree in the park, that is. Then perhaps you can tell me how a lady's sandal came to lodge among its branches." The question fell like a stone into still water. For an instant the man's jaw slackened. Then he recovered himself with a surly laugh. "Lord bless thee, sir, I couldn't say. Wind, maybe, or a rook meddling." Holmes smiled faintly. "Perhaps you use resin in your work, I think. Aeon, the pruning saws. Thank you. That will suffice." And with a gesture of dismissal, he turned to the door, where the groomer, fresh-faced young fellow with a frank, open countenance, waited his turn. "Your name is Barnes. Good. You were in the stable loft last night. Did you hear anything unusual?" The lad scratched his head. "Well, sir, there was a sort of thud, like summit droppin', at about 3 o'clock. I thought it might be a loose tile, so I looked out, but there was no starin'. At what hour do you feed the dogs?" "First thing, Sursec sharp, and they were quiet during the night." "Quiet as lambs, sir. Not so much as a bark." "Remarkable," murmured Holmes. "That will do, Barnes." Susan, the maid, was next ushered in, a trim, neat-handed wench with shrewd eyes and an air of suppressed excitement. "You were the first to enter Miss Weatherby's room this morning, I understand?" Holmes began. "Yes, sir, when she rang at 6. Found her sittin' up in bed, pale as a sheet, staring at the open winder. 'Susan,' says she, 'the sandal's gone.' And sure enough, one of 'em was missing." "Did you observe anything else?" "Well, if you'll pardon me, sir, the rug before the winter was rumpled like, and there was a queer smell sort o' sticky, like tar." "Thank you, Susan, that will be all." The door closed behind her, and scarcely had the echo died when another figure crossed the threshold, a figure so utterly at variance with the others that I started in surprise. Slender, elegant, with dark eyes aglow beneath level brows, and a smile that barely stirred the finely cut lips, such was Cyril Morton, Lord Weatherby's guest. His attire bore the easy perfection of the West End. Yet there was in his manner a subtle hint of self-possession verging upon insolence. "You wished to see me, Mr. Holmes," he said, with a faint inflection that suggested amusement rather than concern. "Merely to inquire. Returned my companion safely, whether you, too, were undisturbed last night?" "Perfectly so. I slept in the sleep of innocence." Holmes' gaze lingered a fraction longer than courtesy demanded. "Have you known the family for a long—" "For years," was the careless reply. "Lady Weatherby and my mother were at school together, indeed. That is all I need to trouble you with at present." And with a bow that dismissed the subject, as effectively as the speaker. Holmes turned away when the door had closed. He dropped into a chair and clasped his hands behind his head, the shadow of a smile flickering about his thin lips. "Watson," said he softly, "our little gallery is complete: the wary rustic, the honest groom, the talkative maid, and, but assuredly not least, the gentleman with the easy laugh and the inscrutable eyes. A curious quartet." "Holmes," I cried, "do you suspect?" "My dear fellow," he interposed, "I suspect everybody and nobody. It is the only safe attitude in these preliminary stages. But note this: when the hounds are mute, the quarry is within. Remember that." He rose abruptly. "Come, we have work before us. This afternoon we revisit the East Wing. There is a certain point which must be tested, one upon which the whole fabric may turn." And with that enigmatic utterance he strode from the room, leaving me tingling with curiosity and conjecture. Chapter 5. The First Suspects. The Red Herring. The events of the morning had left me with a singular sense of oppressing feeling that the old house was permeated with some sinister secret which eluded our grasp, yet lurked behind every curtained recess and paneled wall. Holmes, to my growing exasperation, vouchsafed nothing of his thoughts. He moved about with a noiseless, cat-like tread, his eyes glittering beneath half-lowered lids, his long, nervous fingers ceaselessly playing with a magnifying lens which he now and then raised to some apparently trivial object, only to replace it with a smile of enigmatic satisfaction. It was shortly after luncheon when a fresh actor entered our little drama in the person of Inspector Lestrade. The dapper official, trim of figure and keen of eye, bustled in with all the air of a man upon whom fortune has smiled. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," he cried, rubbing his hands. "So you've not wasted time in coming down. Curious case, isn't it? But I think we've got the scent already. Pretty plain one too, if you'll allow me to say so." Holmes regarded him with an expression of languid amusement. "Indeed, your discoveries will, as always, prove most instructive. Pray enlighten us." The inspector drew a chair to the fire and seated himself with evident relish. "Well, sir, it's this way. There's the gardener, old Grimshaw. Surly dog, and no wonder. He's been drinking. My men found a flask half full in his shed. What's more, he's in debt, deep in debt. Local tradesmen swear by it. And mark this, he knows every inch of the grounds, every tree and branch. Who but he could have fixed that sandal where it was found? I confess the theory struck me as plausible enough. Grimshaw's embarrassed manner, his evasive replies, his knowledge of the Oakthies facts fitted the case with ominous neatness. But Holmes only smiled his thin, cold smile. "A very pretty chain," said he, "though a trifle too symmetrical for my taste. However, pray continue." "There's little more," returned Lestrade, "except that the fellow was out o' bed part of the night, couldn't deny it. Says he was mending a broken latch in the tool-house. Convenient explanation, eh?" Holmes flicked a speck of ash from his cuff. "Remarkably so. And your next step?" "I've a man shadowing him now. If we find the missing buckle or the mate to that resin stain in his possession, the game's up." "A brilliant prospect," murmured Holmes, with such gravity that I detected the lurking irony. "Yet before you clap the bracelets upon Grimshaw, permit me a trifling experiment. Watson, oblige me by accompanying Lestrade and our worthy rustic to the East Wing at 3 o'clock. I shall follow presently, may I ask?" began Lestrade. "You may," interrupted Holmes suavely, "but you will receive no answer for the present. Till then, good fortune attend your efforts." The hour named found us assembled beneath the giant oak whose gnarled limbs still held their sinister secret in my imagination. The ground beneath was thick with last year's leaves, sodden with moisture, and marked by many a deep indentation. Lestrade, brisk and confident, directed Grimshaw to indicate the precise spot where he claimed to have been at work. The old man complied sullenly, muttering oaths under his breath. "Looks bad for him," whispered Lestrade, nudging me. "See how he hangs his head." But Holmes, who had appeared suddenly and without sound, like some great-clad apparition, only smiled and began to examine the turf with minute attention. He produced a tape and measured the distance from the lowest bough to the ground. Then, with a spring that astonished me, he caught a branch, swung himself lightly upward, and in an instant was astride the very limb where the sandal had been discovered. "Remarkable," he observed, peering down, "a feat of no mean agility. How old is Grimshaw?" 60, if a day," grunted Lestrade. "Then we may acquit him of gymnastics," said Holmes dryly. "Observe, Watson, the bark here is rubbed smooth, as though by recent friction. Yet the marks are too light for a man's weight, far too light. Something was hauled up, not someone." With that he dropped to the ground, dusted his hands, and turned upon the discomfited inspector. "My dear Lestrade, your theory has but one defect. It happens to be impossible. Come, we waste daylight. There is work indoors." We returned to the house in a silence broken only by Lestrade's occasional snort of disgust. In the library Holmes flung himself into an armchair and regarded us with a whimsical gleam. "Let us, for argument's sake, assume Grimshaw innocent," said he. "Who then?" "The groom. He is honest to the verge of stupidity. The maid, a possibility, but hardly an acrobat. There remains Mr. Cyril Morton," I hazarded. Holmes' brows lifted a fraction of an inch. "Your instincts do you credit, Watson. Morton interests me. His attitude is one of detachment, too perfect, too polished. Yet we must not gallop before the hounds. For the moment, let Lestrade hug his red herring." "It will serve our turn and your own?" I asked. "My own is a more delicate line, one which requires a certain bait. Ah, here comes Lady Weatherby. Madam," he added, rising with a bow as our hostess entered, pale and tremulous, "a word with you, if I may, concerning the key to your daughter's escritoire." Her start, her sudden pallor were not lost upon me. Holmes, with the tact of a diplomatist, led her gently aside. Their voices sank to an indistinct murmur, while I paced the hearthrug in a fever of curiosity. What new element was creeping into the case? Why that mention of a desk? What secret papers might it contain? Holmes rejoined us presently, his face inscrutable as marble. "The dusk falls early in these latitudes," said he, glancing toward the window. "Watson, pray keep yourself disengaged this evening. I may require your company, possibly your revolver." "My revolver," I exclaimed. He smiled a thin, cold smile that sent a chill through me. "When one walks in darkness, my dear fellow, it is wise to carry a light, and sometimes steel." Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A Hidden Inconsistency. It was close upon 8 o'clock when Holmes summoned me from the little chamber that had been allotted to my use. I found him awaiting me in the corridor, his tall figure dimly outlined by the flickering glow of a single lamp. His face, pale and drawn with the intensity of thought, wore that peculiar expression which I had learned to associate with some supreme mental effort. "Come, Watson," he said in a low tone. "The household supposes us with cards with Lestrade, which is well. Bring your revolver, loaded, if you please. We may require no more than its moral effect, but it is as well to be prepared." The chill of his words was not lessened by the quiet composure with which they were uttered. I slipped the weapon into my pocket and followed him down the shadowy passage, our footfalls muffled by the thick carpeting. Holmes carried a dark lantern and moved with that stealthy swiftness which, even in moments of peril, had for me a curious fascination. "Whither are we bound?" I whispered. "To the east wing," he returned. "Lady Weatherby has retired. The servants are below. We shall have the field to ourselves. Hush." He halted abruptly before a door, listened intently, then slipped the key into the lock and turned it with noiseless dexterity. A faint odor of violet sachet met us as we entered. The room was a boudoir dainty feminine, with pale silk hangings and a litter of trifles upon the tables. Holmes crossed to a writing desk of rosewood, which stood in the recess of the window. From his pocket he drew a small steel instrument, and in a few seconds the lock yielded. "I dislike violence, even to furniture," he murmured, "but truth is a greater law than property. Now, Watson, observe." He spread the contents upon the blotting pad, a sheaf of letters tied with blue ribbon, a miniature of a young officer in uniform, some faded flowers, and, most curious of all, a little phial of amber liquid. Holmes examined each item with microscopic care, but his attention settled finally upon the letters. They were addressed in a bold masculine hand to Miss Clara Weatherby, and bore foreign stamps: Paris, Vienna, Rome. He read swiftly, his brows contracting. "Ha!" he exclaimed at last. "So we begin to see the edge of the web. Note this passage, Watson. If your father knew, the scandal would be irreparable. That was penned 3 months ago. And here again, the sandal, symbol of our pledge, guarded as you would your life." I stared at him in amazement. "Then the sandal was not placed yonder by hazard. It is a tokena sign between two souls. But why should the pledge of love figure in a tragedy? That, Watson, is the kernel of our riddle." He tied the letters swiftly and restored them to their place, leaving all as we had found it. Then, taking up the little phial, he held it against the lamplight. Laudanum half empty. Strange, is it not? Our fair Clara suffers no illness that I have heard. Yet laudanum has 2 offices: to soothe pain and to seal silence. The words sent a shudder through me. "Holmes," I cried, "you do not mean—" "I mean nothing yet. I only collect fragments, Watson, fragments that pieced together may make a pattern. Come, we have lingered too long." We regained the corridor and stole back to the library, where Lestrade awaited us with ill-concealed impatience. He was seated at the table, drumming with his fingers and glancing ever and anon at the clock. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he burst out as we entered, "I've news that will interest you. We've searched Grimshaw's quarters in. Look at this." He flung upon the table a strip of leather, stained and frayed at the edge. "The missing sandals fellow, found at the bottom of his chest." Holmes took it between finger and thumb, examined it under the lamp, and smiled faintly. Indeed. Then I congratulate you, Lestrade. You have captured your man, provided that you can also explain how Grimshaw came by this. He drew from his pocket a small, shining object, a buckle of chased silver, identical with that which had adorned the sandal in the oak. Where did you get that? Cried the inspector, startled out of his composure. From the shrubbery 10 paces from the east veranda. It was trodden deep in the mold, as though torn off in a struggle. Now, if Grimshaw climbed the tree and afterwards wandered to the veranda, dropping his trophy by the way, your case is complete. If not, he spread out his hands with a little gesture of mock admiration. Lestrade bit his lip. Always a quibble. Well, we'll see what a magistrate thinks. Do so, said Holmes, sinking into an armchair and lighting a cigarette. Meanwhile, I shall pursue my own humble research. It was near midnight when Holmes and I sat alone by the dying fire. Lestrade had retired in high dudgeon, and the house was wrapped in slumber. Outside, the wind moaned among the trees like the voice of a restless spirit. Holmes lay back with closed eyes, but I knew from the quick play of his fingers upon the arm of the chair that his brain was racing. You are puzzled, Watson, he said suddenly, utterly. That buckle, what does it signify? That, my dear fellow, is the inconsistency which turns Lestrade's theory to wastepaper. If the sandal was a mere freak of malice, why should its fellow be hidden in Grimshaw's chest, while this ornament lies yonder, yards away? No, there is a deeper motive than spite, a motive bound up with passion, secrecy, and fear. Tonight we were upon the threshold of it. Tomorrow, he broke off abruptly, and a strange light leaped in his eyes. Tomorrow, Watson, the shadows will lift. Till then, silence. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. Awoke the next morning to the gray melancholy of a sky heavy with rain. The lawns beyond my window lay sodden and desolate, and the branches of the great elms tossed wildly in the wind. There was in the air that indefinable tension which seemed to foretell impending disaster. Holmes had risen before me. When I descended to the breakfast room, I found him pacing the carpet with quick, nervous strides, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his dressing gown, his brows knitted in a dark frown of thought. The fire burned low upon the hearth. Lestrade sat near it, yawning over the columns of the Times, his expression one of ill humor and baffled obstinacy. Watson, cried Holmes, as I entered, your constitutional slumber does you credit. You perceive our friend Lestrade wears the look of one who has dined heartily upon his own conclusions, and finds them difficult to digest. Lestrade scowled. If you have anything better to offer, Mr. Holmes, he snapped, I shall be glad to hear it. As for me, I am for Grimshaw. The evidence is plain enough for any reasonable mind. Reasonably is, said Holmes softly, but not necessarily right. Tell me, Lestrade, did you lock the fellow in the east wing as arranged? Barred and bolted. He could no more escape than fly. Holmes smiled a singular, fleeting smile that boded mischief. Then, Watson, it is idle to waste an argument. The facts will speak for themselves. Meanwhile, I beg you both to breakfast. A man reasons ill upon an empty stomach. It was shortly after the meal, barely 9 o'clock, when the first alarm came. A housemaid, white-faced and trembling, burst into the room, her cap awry, her breath coming in sobs. Oh, sir, Miss Clarucci's gone. Her bed has not slept in her clothes, half of them gono. Sir, what are we to do? Lestrade sprang to his feet with an oath. Gone, d'ye say? Since when? Since last night, Setley's. She was in her room at 10, for I carried up hot water. But this morning naught but her dressing gown upon the chair. Holmes was already at the door, his keen face alight with grim resolve. Come, Watson, quick. We followed the terrified girl up the broad staircase and along the corridor to a chamber hung with pale blue chintz. The bed stood smooth and untouched, save for the dent of a single head upon the pillow. On the floor lay a crumpled note, which Holmes pounced upon and read aloud. Do not seek me. I bring shame upon all I love. Forgive. The storm had somewhat abated when we set forth, but the wind still swept the moor in long, melancholy gusts, and the rain drove in fitful scuds across the landscape. Holmes rode first, his hawk-like eyes searching every dip and hollow. We struck into a bridle path that led eastward between heather-clad ridges, the sodden earth bearing many tracks blurred by the night's tempest. At a point where the path forked, Holmes flung up his hand. Here, he cried, leaping to the ground. Kneeling in the mire, he scrutinized a faint impression, a woman's foot, small and arched, with the print of a riding boot sharply defined in one place where the soil was firmer. Beside it lay the broken tip of a whip. She passed here yesterday at midnight, if I read right, said Holmes. Ansee, Watson, what is this? He held up a shred of blue silk clinging to a bramble. From her gown. The trail runs toward the fir copse yonder. On we went, sometimes losing the track amid the sodden leaves, sometimes recovering it by some almost invisible cinnamon-crushed tuft of moss, a twig bent downward, a tiny stain upon a stone. It was a weird, silent chase, broken only by the hoarse cry of the wind and the muffled beat of our horses' hoofs. Suddenly, Holmes checked his stride and stood rigid, his gaze fixed upon a dark object, half hidden among the roots of an oak. With a cry, I sprang forward and recoiled. It was a riding habit, sodden with rain, torn as though by desperate hands. In its pocket lay a purse and a little handkerchief, but no further trace of its owner. Lestrade's face darkened. God help us. The girl's done herself a mischief. Not so, said Holmes calmly. Seeth the ground here is trampled by two people, and these, he pointed to a deep print beyond the oak, are the marks of a man's boot nails in the sole, wide apart. No, Lestrade, the game is afoot, and grimmer than before. We pressed on through the copse, and emerged upon a hollow fringed with reeds, where a pool of black water lay gleaming under the sullen sky. It was there we found the second token, a glove, soaked and muddy, yet bearing in its corner the initials C.W. Holmes, regarded it for a long moment, then slipped it into his breast pocket. We have learned what we may from the open. The next step lies indoors among human hearts. And so, wet and weary, we rode slowly through the gathering dusk, each man wrapped in his own thoughts. For me, a vague foreboding pressed like lead upon my spirit. What dark destiny had driven that unhappy girl forth into the tempest? And what ruthless hand had dragged her from the path of safety into what? I glanced at Holmes. His lips were compressed, his eyes cold and shining as steel. Whatever the secret, I knew he held some clue, which, as yet, he chose not to reveal. The shadows thicken, Watson, he said softly as we neared the gates. But when the darkness is deepest, the dawn is nearest. Chapter 8. Broken only by the hiss of rain upon the sodden gravel and the jangle of our breath. Night had fallen by the time we dismounted, and a raw wind whistled through the gaunt chimneys, rattling the casements like the fingers of some uneasy spirit. The house loomed grim and vast against the livid sky, every window a yellow eye glaring through the gloom. Holmes flung his cloak upon a chair and passed straight to the library, where a great fire of logs roared upon the hearth. His manner had grown composed, almost languid, yet I detected in the quick flicker of his gray eyes that steely brightness which boded swift and sudden action. Lestrade followed, scowling, and the servants hovered in the doorway, whispering in awed tones. "Send them to their quarters," said Holmes curtly. "All but Mr. Weatherby, Mr. Grimshaw, and Miss Dalton. I shall require a few words with those three." Lestrade lifted his brows. "Why these in particular?" "Because," answered Holmes, with that dry little smile of his, "they interest me." When the room was cleared, and the three persons named had been summoned, Holmes lounged back in an armchair, his long fingers steepled, his gaze half-veiled, as though in idle reverie. Yet I knew that every nerve of his was strung to the concert pitch. Mr. Weatherby entered first, a tall, stooping man whose face, lined and haggard, bore witness to a night of sleepless misery. Close upon his heels came Grimshaw, sullen and defiant, his dark eyes smoldering under knitted brows. Last of all swept Miss Dalton, imperious as ever, her scarlet lips curved in a disdainful smile, her jewels flashing like cold fire against the somber folds of her gown. Holmes rose with a bow that was the perfection of courtesy. "Pray be seated, madam gentlemen. You are aware, no doubt, that Miss Clara has left the house." Miss Dalton's smile grew hard. "So the servants babble. I presume she has gone to join some rustic admirer. These country girls, how shall I phrase it, lack stability." "Possibly," said Holmes, and his voice was smooth as silk. "And yet the rustic admirer, who wears boots with hobnails an inch apart, would you not agree, Miss Dalton?" The scarlet lips whitened ever so slightly. She leaned back, tapping her foot upon the rug. "Really, Mr. Holmes, your persiflage wears me. Is it your practice to quiz your host's guests as though they stood in the dock?" Holmes made her a little bow. "Forgive me. My methods are abrupt, but they serve. And now, question or two. Mr. Weatherby, when did you last see your daughter?" The old man's voice trembled. "At supper, Mr. Holmes. She complained of a headache and left the table early. I went to her room at 11. She seemed asleep. God help me. Had I but known you observed nothing unusual in her manner. Nothing save that she was pale. Ah, if harm has come to her." Holmes' hand went out in a gesture almost of gentleness. "Courage, sir. We shall find her yet." Then, turning suddenly upon Grimshaw, "And you, sir, you were absent from the house last evening." The tutor's dark face flushed. "I walked upon the terrace for an hour. My brain was fevered, I needed air." "Is that a crime?" "Not in law," said Holmes, softly, "though in logic it may bear inquiry." "Pray, did you meet anyone?" "No." The denial came sharp as a pistol shot. Holmes' gray eyes dwelt on him for a long moment, eyes that seemed to pierce the very marrow of a man's soul. Then, with a little shrug, he turned away and began to pace the room, his hands clasped behind him. his head sunk upon his breast. For a space there was silence, save for the crackle of the logs and the moan of the wind without. Suddenly Holmes wheeled and addressed Miss Dalton with a briskness that made her start. "You possess, I think, a taste for the dramatic, madam. I appeal to that taste. Will you permit me an experiment in idle fancy, if you will?" She lifted her brows in scorn. "If it amuses you, Mr. Holmes, pray proceed." Holmes rang the bell. "Bring me," said he, to the astonished footman, "a small table, a pack of cards, and 3 wine-glasses." When these had been brought, Holmes arranged the glasses in a row, slipped a card beneath one of them, and smiled round upon the company. A child's game. "You perceive the trick of the hidden card. I conceal it, thus shift the glasses so end. Now, madam, will you indicate which covers the card?" Miss Dalton tapped the center glass with an impatient finger. Holmes raised it hand low. The card lay beneath the one to the right. A ripple of amusement stirred the air. "A mere slight," said Holmes pleasantly, "yet it illustrates how the eye may err when the mind is prepossessed. And now shall we repeat the experiment upon a graver theme? Let us suppose the missing lady stands beneath one of these goblets. The goblet, let us say, of prejudice, of passion, or of fear. Which, think you, conceals her?" The question, though uttered in jesting tone, smote like a whip. Grimshaw's hand clenched till the knuckles showed white. Miss Dalton's bosom rose and fell in quickened rhythm. Mr. Weatherby stared with the blank gaze of one who sees yet understands nothing. Holmes suffered the silence to deepen till it grew tense as wire. Then, sweeping the glasses aside, he said lightly, "The play is ended. We shall resume it later under fairer auspices. For the present, good evening." One by one they filed out, Miss Dalton last, her head high, her eyes flashing with a light that was not wholly anger. When the door had closed, Lestrade turned on Holmes in wrath. "What, in thunder's name, d'ye call that foolery? Are we here to juggle with cards, or to catch a criminal?" Holmes sank into a chair, his thin lips curving in a smile that chilled me more than any frown. "We have done both, my good Lestrade," said he softly. "The card was but a symbol, and the hand that trembles to touch a symbol will shake to grasp a sword." He rose abruptly. "Come, Watson. The hour grows late, and the game, believe me's afoot." Chapter 9. The culprit strikes again. The storm had spent its fury by morning, leaving the world drenched and dim beneath a pall of drifting vapors. Weatherby Grange stood like a fortress besieged by silence, its ivy-clad walls streaming with moisture, its windows staring bleakly across the sodden park. I rose early, for sleep had been a stranger to my pillow. Holmes, I found, was already astir, moving to and fro with that suppressed energy which to my mind is more ominous than any outward sign of haste. He greeted me with a nod and motioned me to the table, where a hasty breakfast smoked untasted. "An hour," said he, glancing at the clock. "An hour will suffice. The game is nearing its climax, Watson. Before the sun sets, the mask will fall. Then you know," I began eagerly. He checked me with a lifted hand. "Patience, my dear fellow. The flower opens not by violence, but by the warmth of the sun. Our task is to supply the warmth." Cryptic as ever, yet his eyes shone with that cold, clear fire which I had learned to associate with moments of supreme effort. The hush of early day hung over the house like a spell. From the hall came the muffled clink of silver as the butler set the luncheon service. Somewhere a door closed softly, and then out of that brooding stillness there rang a cry, sharp, stifled, and so charged with mortal terror that it smote the heart like steel. Holmes was gone before the echo died. Down the corridor he sped, I at his heels, Lestrade lumbering in our wake with oaths that bespoke alike his amazement and his alarm. The cry had come from the western wing, from the very room where Clara Weatherby had last been seen. The door stood wide, the curtains flapped in the draught, and across the threshold sprawled a woman's figure, her face pressed to the boards, her fingers clutching the carpet in agony. It was Miss Dalton. Holmes knelt, raised her gently, and laid her upon the bed. A thin line of crimson trickled from a wound upon the temple. Her breath came in quick, convulsive gasps. A glancing blow, he murmured, examining the wound with swift precision. The hand that struck meant murder, but was balked by fortune or by fear. Good Lord, panted Lestrade, mopping his brow. This goes beyond all bounds. Who could have done it? Holmes' eyes swept the room in one lightning glance, over the rifled dressing table, the open window, the scattered papers on the floor. Then, springing to his feet, he crossed to the window and leaned out. The rain had ceased, but the gravel path beneath was plowed into mire by a myriad footprints. Holmes stooped, peered intently, and gave a little sigh of satisfaction. What's in your lens? Quick, I passed him the magnifier. He bent, scrutinized, and then, with a low chuckle, produced from the gutter a small object that gleamed dull in the gray light. It was a sleeve link, gold and curiously wrought with a device of interlaced serpents. Holmes balanced it upon his palm, his face inscrutable. A token, said he softly, which speaks though in a tongue few men can read. By this time Miss Dalton had recovered sufficiently to whisper a broken tale. She had been writing letters, she said, when a stealthy step sounded behind her. Before she could turn, a shadow fell, a blow descended, and darkness swallowed all. Of her assailant she knew nothing save that he came and went like a phantom. Holmes listened with grave courtesy, but his gaze dwelt less upon her than upon the crimson smear upon the carpet, a smear that trailed, faint yet perceptible, from the dressing table to the open casement. Lestrade, said he quietly, the wound bled after the blow, not before. Ergo, the assailant rifled yonder drawer ere he struck. And what did he take? Holmes' long finger pointed to a square of dust upon the velvet lining, a dustless square where some object had lain. A box, said he, a small box of morocco or shagreen. What did it contain, Miss Dalton? Her eyes flickered only for an instant, yet in that instant the proud mask slipped, and I read in her glance a flash of fear, of anger. And was it guilt? A trinket, she faltered. A mere trinket of no value. Holmes bowed with ironical grace. Doubtless. And now, if you are able to walk, I counsel you to keep to your room and bolt your door. When she had gone, supported by the housekeeper, Holmes turned upon Lestrade with a gesture that brooked no delay. Double the watch, man. Bar every door and window. Let no soul pass the gates without your sanction. This house is a powder magazine. Another spark, and it will blaze to heaven. Lestrade bustled out, purple with perplexity. Holmes stood for a moment motionless, the sleeve link glittering in his fingers, his gaze fixed upon vacancy. Then, thrusting the trinket into his pocket, he said between his teeth, "The net tightens, Watson. The fish struggles and bites, but he shall not break the mesh. Come, there is work to do, and little time to do it." We spent the next hour in a search so minute that it left no cranny unexplored. Drawers were ransacked, presses sounded, carpets lifted. Yet of the missing morocco box we found no trace. Only, in the angle of the window seat, Holmes pounced upon a shred of torn paper, a shred that bore upon its ragged edge the fragment of a name, double quotes, ... Ra. He regarded it with a curious smile. "Our phantom," said he, "grows corporeal. A few more touches and the portrait will be complete." Then, with one of those lightning changes of mood which ever amazed me, he fell to humming an old French chanson as he locked the shred within his pocketbook. "Watson," he cried gaily, "do you recall the words of the old poet, 'Il n'est si grand peril que temps n'y se tourne'? There is no peril so great that timely wit may not turn it aside. And by all the gods, the time is now." His eyes kindled. His nostrils quivered. He seemed a hound that scents the quarry after a long and fruitless quest. "Is mine end. It will shake this house to its foundations." Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface that afternoon, broke, sullen, and oppressive. The heavy sky pressing low upon the dripping elms and sodden lawns of Weatherby Grange. Within, the sense of strain was almost tangible. Doors opened and closed stealthily. Whispers ran along the corridors like the rustle of unseen wings. And on every face, servant and guest alike, I read that nameless dread which is born of lurking peril. Holmes, however, seemed transformed. The moody abstraction of the morning had fallen from him like a cloak. He was brisk, alert, almost debonair, yet with that steely glint in his gray eyes which told me his brain was working at its highest tension. "Watson," said he, as we stood together in the library, "did it strike you that our friend Lestrade bears himself like a man who has solved the problem?" I observed. "He was almost cheerful when we met him in the hall," I replied. "Precisely. He scents an arrest. But mark me, Watson, when the official mind is most elated, the precipice yawns nearest. Our task is to see that he does not tumble headlong and drag us with him." He drew from his pocket the sleeve link, the sinister little token with its intertwined serpents. It glittered coldly in the one light. "Behold our Ariadne's thread," he said softly. "Gold and enamel, but more than that, a sign, a badge, a confession of faith, if you will. Observe the workmanship, French beyond doubt, and older than our century by 50 years. Where in this household does such a relic find its natural home? In the possession of a groom, a secretary, a provincial spinster? Hardly. No, Watson, this trinket whispers of lineage, of pride, of some old unholy bond. And where pride is, passion crouches, passion, and the peril it breeds." His words set my imagination aflame, yet the veil still hung thick. Before I could frame a question, the door opened, and Clara Weatherby entered. She was pale, but composed for one whose friend had so narrowly escaped death. Her morning gown, of some soft black fabric, lent a statuesque grace to her slender figure, and in her eyes, dark and steadfast, I read a purpose as cold as it was inflexible. You wanted to speak with me, Mr. Holmes. Holmes bowed with that grave courtesy which masked his keenest thrusts. Madam, said he, I seek only light upon a trifle, the merest trifle. You were acquainted, I presume, with the contents of the Morocco case, which has mysteriously vanished. She did not start. Only the faintest quiver touched the proud curve of her lip. The case contained a jewel, she said slowly, a brooch of no great value, at least, none to others. To me it was precious. Ah, keepsake. Yes, she answered, after an instant's pause, from my mother. Holmes inclined his head, his gaze unwavering. And the device upon that brooch, was it? Like a conjurer, he held out the sleeve link, its twin serpents writhing in the lamplight. For one heartbeat her eyes flamed, then the lids drooped, and her voice came cold and level. I have never seen it before. Holmes slipped the token back into his pocket with a gesture as suave as it was final. I thank you, said he. Your courtesy lightens my task. That will be all for the moment. She bent her head in silent acknowledgment and swept from the room with a step that was almost regal. For some moments Holmes stood motionless, his chin sunk upon his breast, his long fingers drumming soundlessly upon the table. Then, lifting his head with a sudden jerk, he broke into a laugh, short, mirthless, but charged with triumph. Watson, he cried, did you mark the spark, the flash behind the mask? By all that's wonderful, the drama deepens. Passion, Watson, passion, and a purpose black as night. She would lay and kill sooner than yield that secret, and yet she shall yield it when the hour strikes. But the motive, what in heaven's name can it be? I burst out. Torn between bewilderment and eagerness, he wheeled upon me, his eyes aglow. The motive, he echoed. There's the crux. Strip this enigma of its wrappings, what do we find? A dead man, slain with devilish cunning, a token of serpent's emblem of craft and vengeance, a trinket torn from hiding, a woman who trembles at its name. Blend these elements, Watson, and what is the resultant? Not theft, there lies no fortune here. Not jealous love, for where is the lover? No, my dear fellow, the mainspring is deeper, older rooted in some soil of bygone wrong. There is blood upon this tree, Watson, blood that cries from the grave. His voice rang like a clarion in the dim room, then sank as swiftly as it had risen. He flung himself into a chair, lit his pipe, and sat wreathed in smoke, brooding like some dark prophet of doom. The hour that followed was fraught with a tension I cannot picture in words. Guests crept by with hushed steps. Servants moved as though beneath the lash of unseen whips. And through it all Holmes sat motionless, his eyes half closed, his lean figure carved in ebony against the crimson glow of the hearth. Only once did he stir to take from his pocket a sheet of paper and scrawl upon it certain lines and figures with lightning speed. At last he rose, crushing the paper into his pocket. His face was gray as steel, his eyes like flints. Watson, said he, the coil tightens. Before midnight the sword must fall where we are lost. One move, Morand the king is mated. Come, we have a trap to set. Chapter 11. The bait. Holmes' grand strategy. The storm which had brooded all day broke at nightfall, and the ancient gables of Weatherby Grange shook beneath the lash of wind and rain. In the flickering candlelight of the library I found Holmes at the great oak table, his long fingers busy with a strip of parchment and a shallow tray of fine gray powder. "Holmes," I cried in amazement, "are we dabbling in alchemy?" He glanced up, his face pale but afire with purpose. "In a sense, yes," he said coolly. "The transmutation of suspicion into certainty, that is the philosopher's stone we seek. Behold." He lifted the parchment. Across its surface ran lines of writing in his bold hand, yet what words they formed I could not tell, for the strokes were faint as the tracery of frost. "A message," he said softly. "A lure as delicate as the gossamer thread of the spider. You shall assist me in placing it where hungry eyes shall light upon it." I stared in bewilderment. "Holmes, in heaven's name, to what end?" He smiled that thin, dangerous smile which told me the game was nearing its climax. "To draw the creature from its lair, Watson. For 3 days we have hunted in darkness. Now we shall see. Within the hour the snare will be set, and by dawn, if fate be kind, the mask will be torn from the face of guilt." Within half an hour we had quitted the library and groped our way through a corridor that smelt of age and mildew. Holmes bore a lantern, shading its glow with his fingers, and in his other hand the sheet of parchment. At last we paused before a narrow door set deep in the paneling, a place of dusty parchments and forgotten bonza sanctuary where one might dream undisturbed. "Mark the bolt upon the outer side a trifle, which has served us well." With noiseless speed he slipped within. I followed close. The chamber was low and vaulted, its shelves laden with deeds and charter boxes dim with the grime of centuries. Upon a central table Holmes laid the parchment, weighting its corners with rusty keys. Then, stooping, he sprinkled the gray powder lightly upon the floor about the table's foot. "Powdered plumbago," he murmured in answer to my glance. "Invisible to the careless eye, but to me, tomorrow, it shall speak volumes." "Holmes," I whispered, "what does the writing say?" He straightened himself, and for an instant the mask of irony fell away, leaving his face keen and grim. "It says, the sleeve link has been found. It lies in safety until the hour of confession. Midnight by the yew tree, that is the bait, Watson. If guilt walks in flesh, those words will burn like molten lead. Kumar, task here is done." We regained the corridor unchallenged, and soon were back in the library, where the wind howled and the rain beat like musketry against the casements. Holmes threw himself into a chair, his hands steepled, his gaze fixed upon the leaping flames. "It is a hazard," he said slowly. "If I read the riddle aright, the hour is at hand when pride will stab and passion strike its last blow. If I read amiss," he broke off with a shrug. "Well, Watson, you have your revolver." I touched my breast pocket. "Always, Holmes, good. Keep it loose in the holster. Tonight the shades of Weatherby Grange may witness such a drama as even its blood-stained chronicles have not known." He sank into silence, his face carved in shadow and firelight, while the storm rioted without and the house lay in that dreadful hush which is born of expectation. For myself, I confess my nerves were strung to what was this hidden horror toward which we moved? What ghastly secret did these rain-lashed walls enfold? And why, above all, did I feel that the answer lay not in brute force or gold, but in some dark chapter of human pride and vengeance, older than our day and deadlier than death? At length Holmes stirred, and the flicker of the lamp showed his eyes like cold stars under lowering brows. "Watson," said he in a tone that cut like steel, "the hour draws near. Before the clock strikes 12, the hand of Cain will move on. We must be there to grasp it." He rose, thrust his long arms into his Inverness, and buckled the hunting crop across his wrist. "Come," he said, "the night wind is wild, but wilder yet shall be the passion that drives a soul to ruin before the dawn." Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. Hour was a few minutes shy of midnight when Holmes and I crept through the sodden grounds of Weatherby Grange. The gale shrieking like a legion of lost souls, our lantern, hooded and low, sent a frail gleam upon the streaming gravel and the dripping ewes that loomed like specters in the tempest. Holmes strode on with the purposeful gait I knew so well, his cloak clinging like a dark wing to his spare frame, his eyes glittering under the rim of his hat. I confess that my own heart beat faster than was my wont. The message, the bet lay snug in the munition room, and if Holmes's fierce instinct had not played him false, the night would see its answer in living flesh. At the bend of the path he halted, his hand on my sleeve. "Listen," he whispered. Through the roar of wind and rain I caught it, a stealthy sound, faint yet unmistakable, the squelch of a footfall upon sodden turf. Then another and another approaching from the rear of the shrubbery. Holmes's fingers tightened. "He comes. Keep to the shadow of this yew, and stir not till I give the word." We shrank into the darkness, our lantern quenched, peering between the dripping branches. I saw a figure flit across the pallid gleam of the rain-swept lawn, a tall figure, muffled in a cloak, the head bent low against the storm. Swift and silent, it glided toward the angle of the house where the muniment room crouched like a vault. Holmes's lips brushed my ear. "The fish takes the fly, Watson. Now watch." The intruder gained the door. For an instant his form was etched black against the lighter stone. Then he stooped, and I heard the faint scrape of metal on wood. The door yielded noiselessly. The figure vanished within. Holmes was beside me like a shadow. His hand gripped my wrist, and in the sudden stillness of the dripping night, I felt rather than heard the fierce throb of triumph that ran through him. "Come," he breathed. We stole across the lawn, our feet soundless on the spongy turf. The door gaped black before us. From the depths within came the feeble glimmer of a candle. Against that pallid ray a silhouette moved, bent over the central table where lay the parchment bait. Holmes slipped past me like a panther. His long arm shot out, and in a heartbeat the figure was whirled about, the cloak torn aside, and the candle's flare leaped on a face that froze me in sheer amazement. "Holmes," I gasped. "Good heavens, it is silence, Watson," came the cutting whisper. "Not a word, not yet. The man, yes, the man, for all the mask of smooth breeding and conventional grace, stood rigid, his lips drawn back in a snarl that was half defiance, half despair. In his eyes blazed that terrible light I have seen in wild creatures at bay. "So," said Holmes softly, "the net closes and the spider is snared." The fellow made no answer. His glance darted to the door, to the narrow window barred against the storm. Then, with a sudden snarl, he struck savagely at Holmes's breast. I sprang forward, but my friend had swerved with the swift certainty of a duelist. The blow spent itself on empty air, and in the next instant Holmes's grip was on the man's wrist like a steel vice. "Enough," he said in a voice that rang cold and inexorable. "No violence, sir. It will not mend what is done. You and I have much to say to each other, but not here. Watson, the lantern." I struck a light with hands that trembled in spite of me. The yellow beam fell on that tragic face pale as death, the dark hair plastered to the brow, the fine features twisted by passions that made them almost unhuman. And as I looked, the last piece of the ghastly puzzle flashed into place. In a blinding glare of memory, I saw the sandal in the tree, the fragment of sleeve link, the faint perfume that clung to the folds of a cloak. And with that revelation came a shuddering sense of the drama's depth, of the pride, the hate, the relentless vengeance that had driven this soul to its black extremity. Holmes's eyes met mine for an instant, a glance keen as a rapier, yet freighted with a meaning I could not wholly grasp. Then, with his prisoner fast in hand, he spoke in that low, level tone I had learned to dread. "Watson," said he, "the hour strikes, the hour of truth. Follow me on, bring your courage, for before dawn you shall look upon such a page of human history as is writ in fire and blood." Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. The prisoner stood between us in the flickering lantern light, his breath coming quick and hoarse, the muscles of his jaw working like those of a trapped beast. The storm without raged with unabated fury, and its moan seemed but the echo of that wild tumult which I read in every line of the man's haggard face. For his part was iron-cold, inflexible, his long fingers gripping the fellow's wrist with a force that drew from him a faint gasp of pain. Yet in that gasp there was no note of submission. Rather, I seemed to feel the fierce energy that smoldered beneath his apparent helplessness, force that might, at any instant, burst its bonds in some desperate attempt for liberty. "Watson," said Holmes curtly, "close that door. Our friend here has a fancy for fresh air, but we shall deny him that luxury for the present." I obeyed, drawing the heavy oak to its socket and shooting the iron bolt. As I turned, the fellow's eyes met mine eyes, that blazed with such concentrated hate that I confess I felt a chill crawl along my spine. "You do yourself no service by violence," Holmes continued evenly. "I warned you once that the game was played out. Take my advice and walk quietly in the path that remains." The man's lips curled in a smile that was like the snarl of a wolf. "Your path, Mr. Holmes," he said, in a voice low yet vibrating with some fierce inner passion, "is not mine. And if you think to hold me like a rat in a trap, why, you little know the breed you deal with." Before either of us could guess his intent, the words were wrenched into act. With a convulsive twist of his whole body, he hurled himself sideways, dragging Holmes from his footing. The lantern crashed to the flags, shattering in a spurt of oil and smoke. In the sudden darkness, I heard the scuffle of feet, the grind of a heel upon stone, and then swift as a thunderclap the shiver of glass. "The window, Watson. Quick!" I sprang toward the sound, striking a match with trembling fingers. Its feeble gleam showed the gaping casement, the lash of rain against the sillon beyond, a darker shadow vanishing into the writhing blackness of the storm. Holmes was through in an instant, his lean figure silhouetted for a heartbeat against the pale blur of the tempest. Then, swallowed by the night, "Stay where you are," came his voice, thin yet clear, above the gale. "Bolt the door and follow when you hear my whistle." I was left alone in that wreck of a room, the last splutter of oil dying on the stone, the night wind wailing through the broken pane like some ghostly dirge. I groped for the bolt, shot it home, and stood quivering in the dark, straining my ears for some sound of the chase. It came, a cry, faint yet piercing, flung across the tumult. Then the thud of running feet upon gravel. Then silence, save for the ceaseless roar of wind and rain. Minutes crawled by minutes that seemed as hours. At last, from far down the avenue, there rose a signal, the keen, shrill whistle I knew so well. I snatched the lantern's unbroken horn, struck a light, and plunged forth into the storm. The avenue streamed like a river. The trees writhed and groaned as though in mortal anguish. Half blinded by the lash of the rain, I stumbled on, the wavering gleam of my lantern flinging grotesque shapes upon the streaming trunks. And then, as I breasted the last curve, the light leaped onto figures, one erect and tense, the other prone upon the sodden turf, his arms wrenched behind him in the grip of a strap torn from Holmes's own cloak. "Quick, Watson," cried my comrade. "The courteous, round the ankles so. Our friend has run his last race." The man lay motionless, save for the fierce heave of his chest. But in his eyes never shall I forget the fire that smoldered there. Rage, baffled, pride, a passion so deep and deadly that it made me shudder to think what depths of crime it might have plumbed. Holmes rose, drawing the sodden hair from his brow, his face pale but alight with the cold glow of victory. "The drama quickens, Watson," said he quietly. "We have played act the third and the curtain rises soon upon the last. Come, we must get him under shelter before the storm beats the life out of him. And then, my dear fellow, you shall hear such a tale as even you have never yet set upon paper." He stooped, gripped the captive by the collar, and together we dragged him toward the house, the wind shrieking about us like the laughter of demons. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. Dawn broke sullenly over the drenched landscape, the storm having spent its fury in the night. A thin mist clung to the lawns of Greystone Manor, and the great house itself loomed gaunt and spectral against a pallid sky. Within, the hush was broken only by the ticking of the hall clock and the occasional creak of timbers, as though the old structure stirred uneasily after its night of wild tumult. Holmes sat at the long oak table in the library, his profile sharp against the gray window light. Before him lay a little litter of objects: the sodden sandal, its strap frayed and stained, a crumpled scrap of coarse paper, scrawled upon in a cramped and irregular hand, and most curious of all, a sliver of metal, thin as a knife blade and gleaming dully where Holmes had rubbed away the tarnished dot. Our prisoner, bound and under the eye of Lestrade, kept his sullen silence in the adjoining room. From time to time there came the clink of fetters and the heavy fall of his step as he paced like some caged beast. Holmes, however, seemed unconscious alike of sound and movement. His long fingers played idly with the fragment of metal, his lids drooping over those steel-gray eyes that I knew so well concealed a brain at its fiercest tension. At length he spoke, half to himself, half to me. "Curious, most curious, Watson. Here we have the final piece, the key to a puzzle that has vexed us sorely, and yet, until last night, it lay before our eyes, unheeded. I leaned forward eagerly. You mean this scrap of steel? Precisely. A singular alloys. And note its shape, not the relic of a blade, as one might suppose, but the spring of a clasp such as is used in certain foreign satchels. Add to this the coarse fiber found beneath the sandal strap fibers of camel hair, dyed with an oriental gummed. What picture begins to shape itself? He shot the question at me like a pistol shot, his eyes glittering. I confess it is beyond me, I stammered. Some article of Eastern manufacture. But what Baring Holmes smiled faintly, that thin, cold smile which told me the chase was nearly run to earth. Patience, my dear fellow. Link this with the singular position of the sandal in the utriplace. Mark you, not flung there in panic, but adjusted with curious care, as though to serve some prearranged design. Recall, too, the strange journeys by night, the whispered conferences in the shrubbery, the locked escritoire, and, above all, the absence of any real motive for that clumsy theory of jealousy which so captivated our friends of Scotland Yard. Do you not perceive that we move upon the edge of a design infinitely more subtle, more sinister than aught we have yet suspected? His voice had sunk to a whisper, vibrant with suppressed excitement. He leaned across the table, tapping the sandal with an impatient finger. This, Watson, is no common crime of passion. It is a webbed, deliberate, intricate, and spun by a brain of no mean order. But mark me, the web has one flaw, and last night our friend yonder thrust his foot through it. A single thread snapped, and the whole fabric quivers. Another touch, just one, and it will fall in ruins at our feet. He rose suddenly, his tall figure rigid with that electric energy which always heralded his masterstrokes. Come, the hour is ripe. We shall summon our actors and raise the curtain upon the last act. Lestrade, the inspector, entered, stolid and somewhat damped after his failure of yesterday. You will oblige me by bringing the prisoner to the library within half an hour, and send word to Miss Trelawney and the others. They will attend us here. There is no need for constables beyond the gates. Our net is drawn, and the fish lies within it. Lestrade muttered an assent and withdrew. Holmes turned to me, his face grave, his voice low and tense. Watson, upon what follows hangs more than you dream. There are forces behind this, forces that reach beyond Greystone, beyond Surrey, even beyond England's shores. Before night falls, we shall have dragged them into the light tower. By heaven, they may drag us into darkness. Stand ready, old friend, the game is afoot, and the stake is life or death. A pale gleam flooded the room, cold and merciless as the truth he was about to unveil. And as I looked upon his eagle face, stern and exultant in that wan light, I knew that some tremendous revelation trembled on the verge of speech, yet was held back, like a torrent straining at its barrier, until the supreme moment should strike. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The library of Greystone Manor had been transformed into a stage for the drama that was now to culminate. The great oak table, where Holmes had pored over his clues scarcely an hour ago, now stood clear, save for a single decanter and glasses, as though in grim mockery of hospitality. The curtains were drawn back, admitting the gray daylight, which fell chill and pallid upon the assembled company. Miss Violet Trelawney entered first, pale and composed, her delicate features shadowed with an anxiety she strove in vain to conceal. close upon her followed Mr. Percival Stone, a figure of aggressive self-possession, though his tight lips and restless hands betrayed the tension beneath. Behind them came Mrs. Weatherby, the housekeeper, her broad face flushed and defiant, and with her the gardener Hel's, a man of sullen aspect, whose heavy boots clanked ominously upon the polished floor. Last of all, between two stolid constables, came the prisoner. He bore himself with a strange mixture of bravado and gloom, his eyes shifting from face to face with a light that was half mockery, half menace. Holmes regarded him with that cold, inscrutable gaze before which so many a culprit had quailed, then turned to the group with a slight inclination of the head. "Be seated, if you please," he said quietly. "We are met to clear away certain misapprehensions, to restore, so far as may be, the credit of English justice." There was a murmur, half protest, half relief, but Holmes silenced it with a gesture. He stood at the table's head, tall and commanding, his thin hands resting lightly upon the polished wood. Beside him I took my place, notebook in readiness, my heart beating with an excitement I could scarce disguise, for I knew by that glitter in Holmes's eyes, that iron composure of his features, that the supreme moment of revelation was close at hand. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes began, turning slightly to where the official stood, with legs astride and hands upon hips, "has already assured me that he is prepared to act upon my sole responsibility. For that I tender him my thanks. What is to follow concerns grave issues that touch not merely the liberty of an innocent man, but the honor of this household, and perchance the security of interests far beyond its walls." A visible stir ran through the company. Miss Trelawney caught her breath sharply, while Stone leaned forward, his brows knit in a scowl. The prisoner smiled an ugly, curling smile that set my nerves tingling. Holmes observed it, and his tone hardened. "You may sneer, sir," he said with deadly quietness, "but before this hour strikes, you will find small cause for murder. You have played a daring game, a game that has cost one life already, and might well have cost more but for a single oversight. Shall I tell you what that oversight was?" The man's smile faltered. A faint twitch passed across his jaw. Holmes saw it and pressed on. "A scrap of steel no larger than my fingernail. Trifles, you would say. Yet out of trifles we build the arch that spans the gulf of mystery. Add to these a sandal placed, mark you, with elaborate care in a yew tree, and a picture begins to take form. You, gentlemen, may not yet perceive its outline, but when I have filled in the shadows up, then you shall marvel at its symmetry." He paused, his glance sweeping the ring of strained faces. In the hush I could hear the distant boom of a gong, summoning a servant far down the corridor. Then Holmes spoke again, his voice vibrant with suppressed energy. "Before I proceed, let me say this: what we are about to hear may blast reputations, may shake foundations that seemed secure as granite. Let those who would withdraw do so now." No one stirred. Even Miss Trelawney, white to the lips, sat rigid in her chair, her great dark eyes fixed upon Holmes, as though she drew courage from his very presence. "Good," said he softly. "Then we shall begin. I propose to reconstruct, in your presence, the sequence of events that culminated in the tragedy of last night. Step by step, I shall lead you from the seeming triviality of a sandal in a tree to the monstrous design which that trifle masked. And when we reach the end, The hand that struck the blow and the brain that planned it will stand revealed, naked to the light of day. He threw back his head. The steel flashed in his eyes, and with that superb gesture of mastery which was all his own, he flung the first word of his revelation into the hushed air. It began not at Greystone, but far away, under the burning sun of Alexandria. Chapter 16. The Great Reveal, Alexandria. Holmes repeated, his voice a low, thrilling undertone that compelled every ear. A city of ancient splendor and modern intrigue, fitting birthplace for the drama whose closing act we now approach. It was there, some 5 years ago, that the seeds of this conspiracy were sown. The men who trafficked in antiquities, men with hands none to clean and consciences none to tender, found in a certain English collector both an easy prey and a useful tool. His eyes darted to Mr. Percival Stone, who shifted uneasily in his chair. Yes, Mr. Stone, Holmes continued, with the faintest curl of the lip. I do not say you were of their number, but you trod perilously near their path. You, with your passion for rare things, were the link by which they fastened their chain. And when, by some mischance, a certain treasure vanished, then began the sequence of crime that ended in yonder shrubbery. A murmur ran through the company. Miss Trelawney half rose, her face blanched, her lips forming words that died unspoken. Holmes raised his hand for silence. The treasure, gentlemen, said he impressively, was no bauble of gold or jewel of price, but a fragment an idol's foot, carved from alabaster, worthless to the vulgar eye, yet to the initiated worth a king's ransom. For upon that fragment was graven a cipher, the key to a vault in which lay wealth beyond computing. That cipher passed, by what channel we need not pause to trace, into the keeping of one whose life was the penalty of his trust. He paused, his keen eyes fixed upon the prisoner. The man's hands clenched till the knuckles showed white, but he sat rigid, his jaw thrust forward in dogged defiance. Yes, said Holmes, in a voice that cut like a whip. Henry Kavanagh died because he held that secret hand would not yield it. He died beneath the yew tree, and the sandal placed in grotesque derision above his head was the token of a vengeance long delayed. A gasp broke from Miss Trelawney. Mrs. Weatherby uttered a smothered exclamation. Lestrade leaned forward, his pen suspended. But how, cried I, carried beyond all restraint, how in heaven's name do you connect this barbarous relic with Greystone Manor, with these people, with the murder itself? Holmes smiled a swift, flashing smile of pure intellectual triumph. By that which you call trifles, my dear Watson, the warp and woof of all detection, a smear of Nile mud upon a boot, a whiff of adder lingering in a cloak, a letter burned, yet leaving its impress on the blotting pad, a sandal cunningly wrought, such as no western foot hath worn these 1,000 years. All these, linked by the chain of reason, point to one inevitable conclusion, and that conclusion, said Lestrade hoarsely, that the murder of Kavanagh was but an episode in a scheme vaster and darker than any your imagination has yet conceived. Holmes answered solemnly, that every soul in this room stands, in greater or lesser degree, within the penumbra of its shadow, and that he, his long finger shot out like a sword blade, he who sits yonder, smiling in his chains, is the central figure of that design, the brain, the hand, the heart of it all. A sudden movement shook the room. The prisoner sprang to his feet, the clank of his fetters ringing like steel in the tense silence. His eyes blazed, his lips writhed in a snarl of fury. "Lies, damned lies," he cried. "You prate of proofs, where are they? You cannot touch me, do you hear? Not a hair of my head. I defy you, Holmes, I defy you." Holmes met the outburst with a calm that was more terrible than wrath. "You defy me," he said softly. "We shall see. The sandal in the tree, why was it placed there? To deride us? No, to mislead us. The sandal was never meant for Kavanagh's foot. It was the symbol, the password of a brotherhood whose roots are in the East, whose arm is long enough to strike in London as in Cairo. And you, sir, you are its apostle and its assassin. You planned the death of Kavanagh because he faltered. You planned, too, the ruin of this house, to cloak your flight with plunder. A clever scheme, marred by a single flaw. Shall I tell you what that flaw was?" The man's breath came thick and fast. His eyes wavered beneath the merciless glitter of Holmes's own. The hush was deathlike. "That flaw," said Holmes, in tones of icy precision, "was the smear upon the sandal, a smear of pigment used by no craftsman west of Alexandria. That, sir, was your death warrant." He turned swiftly to Lestrade. "Inspector, the case is yours. In 10 minutes I shall make the entire chain clear to you. For the present, remove the prisoner. His share in this drama is played." The constables closed in. With a last glare of baffled hate, the man suffered himself to be led away. The door clanged. A long breath seemed to rise from every breast. Holmes drew his hand across his brow and sank wearily into a chair. "And now, Watson," said he, with a touch of his old languor, "the curtain rises upon the final act." Chapter 17. The web unraveled. For a moment after the door closed upon the prisoner, silence reigned, silence vibrant with the pulse of unspoken questions. Then Lestrade, his notebook clutched like a weapon, broke forth impetuously. "Mr. Holmes, this is the strangest business I ever struck. You've unmasked the man, but as for the how and the why, well, I'll be hanged if I can make head or tail of it." Holmes smiled faintly, and, stretching his long limbs with a languor born of intellectual fatigue, motioned us to be seated. "You are not alone in your perplexity, Inspector," said he. "But the tangled skein is, I assure you, simpler than it appears. Attend me closely, and the threads shall lie straight." He leaned forward, his fingers steepled, his eyes glowing with the inward fire that always heralded one of his great expositions. "First, let us reconstruct the problem. Henry Kavanagh, a man of scholarly habits and few enemies, is found dead beneath the yew tree at Greystone Manor. There is no sign of struggle, no trace of robbery. And yet in the branch above his head hangs an object so alien, so grotesque, that its presence alone stamps the case with singularity. Sandal wrought after the fashion of the East. That, gentlemen, was our first and capital clue. The sandal spoke of a civilization remote from ours, and, coupled with the faint odor of attar which clung about the dead man's clothing, pointed to an oriental origin for the crime. Next, the discoloration upon the sandal's strap, a pigment unknown in Western manufacture, but familiar to me as the cobalt stain used by Alexandrian artificers. A trifle, you say, yet trifles are the hinges of destiny. Holmes's voice had sunk almost to a whisper. The circle about him bent forward in tense attention. From these two data an Alexandrian pigment and an Eastern emblem I deduced that the crime was rooted in some association beyond seas. Inquiry soon revealed that Kavanaugh had spent years in Egypt, and that his intimacy with certain dealers in antiquities had more than once provoked comment among his friends. A visit to his chambers furnished corroboration. The fragments of a letter, yet legible, in part spoke of a trust and a danger. Trust-danger combined with the symbols of the East. What inference could one draw but that the murdered man had held some treasure, material or otherwise, coveted by men of desperate resource? Miss Trelawney uttered a faint cry, but Holmes, heedless, swept on in his swift, relentless analysis. I next examined the scene of death. Here again the trivial furnished the vital. A smear of Nile mud upon the bark of the U.S. The print of a foreign sole, faint yet unmistakable, in the soft mold. The fragment of a camel hair thread, caught upon a thornall, told the same tale. The presence of one whose recent haunts were far from English soil. Who could this be? The circle narrowed rapidly. Of those within Greystone, only one bore the Eastern stamp, in gesture, in accent, in the subtle betrayals of habit. I observed him, I tested him. His talk betrayed knowledge no casual traveler could possess. His ISA, the eyes of an Oriental fanatic, burning through the mask of Western speech. Then came the final damning link, the discoloration upon his cuff, which, when analyzed, yielded the identical cobalt stain. From that instant, the chain was complete. Holmes paused, his keen glance sweeping the group like a searchlight. As to motive, the letter supplied the clue. The murdered man had been custodian of a relica fragment graven with a cipher that unlocked the treasures of a forgotten shrine. That relic he refused to surrender, and so, by the code of a ruthless brotherhood, he paid the forfeit of his loyalty. Lestrade drew a long breath, his ruddy face working in wonder. By the Lord, Mr. Holmes, you make it sound as clear as day. And yet, bless my soul, to think all that hung on a dab of paint and a whiff of scent. Holmes smiled a smile in which weariness and triumph were strangely blended. It is ever so, Inspector. Life's most colossal tragedies hinge upon the merest trifles. The sandal in the tree was a gesta, savage pleasantry, meant to bewilder us. And, but for that smear of pigment, the jest might have triumphed. He rose slowly, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the hearth. And now, Watson, said he, with the old twinkle glimmering for an instant in his tired eyes, the play is played, the curtain may fall. Chapter 18. Holmes' final reflection. The storm that had beaten against the windows all evening subsided into a mournful drizzle, as though nature herself were weary of violence. Within the dimly lit sitting-room of Greystone Manor, the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint, acrid ghost of tragedy. Miss Trelawney sat near the hearth, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale, yet strangely calm. Her eyes, luminous with unshed tears, were fixed upon the embers, as though the shifting glow might weave for her a gentler memory than the one reality had burned upon her soul. Lestrade had gone to make his report, doubtless with the air of a man who had borne the brunt of responsibility and emerged triumphant. It mattered little to Holmes. He lounged in his habitual fashion, long limbs outstretched, fingers idly drumming upon the arm of the chair. the gray light of thought still lingering in his eyes. "You have shown great courage, Miss Trelawney," said Holmes, at last, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Few would have endured so much and preserved so much dignity." She turned her head slightly, and for the first time since the arrest, her lips curved in a shadowy smile. "Courage, Mr. Holmes," she repeated, and there was a tremor in her tone. "No, only necessity. When one's past rises like a phantom and lays its hand upon the present, there is no choice but to face it." Holmes inclined his head. "You speak wisely. Your candor now may lighten the burden of memory. The relic your cousin guarded, did you know its fatal significance?" "I did," she whispered. "Henry told me once, in Egypt, under the moonlight, by the Nile. He swore me to silence, and I kept the oath. I thought the Brotherhood a legend. I never dreamed its shadow could follow us here." Her voice broke, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Holmes regarded her gravely, but with a certain gentleness. "Legends, Miss Trelawney, are but truths grown dim with time. Yet even the darkest truth has its term." She rose, then, trembling, and extended her hand. "I owe you more than life, Mr. Holmes. If ever gratitude can bridge the gulf of tragedy, you shall not find mine wanting." Holmes bowed, and for a fleeting instant his austere features softened. "We ask no payment save the knowledge that justice has been served." With that, she was gone, a slender figure passing into the rain-veiled night, like a wraith returning to the silence whence it came. For a while neither Holmes nor I spoke. The wind sobbed along the eaves, and the dying fire cast grotesque shadows that leaped and writhed like evil spirits fleeing the scene of their revel. At length I said, "Holmes, there is something devilish in the tenacity of these secret societies. To slay a man for the custody of a ciphered fragment, it chills one's blood." Holmes smiled faintly. Yet there was no mirth in the smile. "My dear Watson," said he, "the history of the world is but the chronicle of men slain for lesser things, symbols, dreams. This Brotherhood of the East differs only in the frankness of its creed. It strikes, not with the pen of diplomacy, but with the blade of vengeance. There is a certain rude honesty in that." He rose, and as he stood outlined against the somber glow of the hearth, I marked the weariness in his face, the weariness of a mind that has probed too deeply into the abysses of human passion. "And yet," he mused, half to himself, "it is the trifles, the things men deem negligible, that betray the mightiest crimes. A smear of pigment, a shred of fiber, a scent faint. The fabric of guilt rends like a gossamer web." His eyes kindled for an instant with the old, keen light. Then, with a shrug, he reached for his coat. "Come, Watson, our work here is done. The rest lies with the law, and the law is adequate if unimaginative. The night train will serve us well. There is tobacco in the bag, and, if fortune smiles, a decent cup of coffee at the junction." As we passed down the echoing corridor, the chill air swept through a shattered casement, and with it the moan of the wind among the yews, the same wind that had whispered above Henry Kavanagh's lifeless form. It seemed to speak of the vanity of human striving, of the shadows that haunt the footsteps of ambition. Holmes paused at the threshold and cast one last glance at the desolate hall. A faint smile touched his lips, the smile of a man who has seen too much to wonder, too much to hope. "Elementary, my dear Watson," said he, and the words fell like the closing cadence of a requiem.